Welcome to another economics class. My name is Emmanuel Wido. In today's class, we are looking at the topic elementary treatment of utility theory in the theme consumer behavior, price determination, and market structures. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to define the concept of total, average, and marginal utility, state and explain the principles of utility maximization and diminishing marginal utility, and lastly, explain why the utility curves slope downwards. When you're thirsty, what do? I am sure you run to the fridge to get a glass of water to quench that thirst. Why do you do that? You do that because there is a need to satisfy thirst. In economics, however, we view satisfaction as utility. But in a layman's term, satisfaction is the ability of a product to bring pleasure when utilized or consumed. So what then is utility? Utility refers to the ability of goods or services to satisfy human wants. So the water you drank was able to quench your thirst. As such, that water had utility. As we go further, we are able to understand that utility is relative to human beings. For you, water could quench your thirst. But for another, it could be a bottle of Coke. Now, that takes us to the type of utilities we have. There are four basic types of utility, and these are time utility, form utility, place utility, and possession utility. Let's look at time utility. The satisfaction derived by a consumer from goods and services at a particular time is referred to as time utility. So the time you took your glass of water is referred to as time utility. That was when you had the need for water. That was when you felt thirsty and you needed water. That is time utility. At that point in time, water was able to quench your thirst. As we go further, let's look at form utility. The transformation of goods or services to convert utility or to bring about utility is what we refer to as form utility. Let me throw more light on that. If mommy wants to bake cake, she goes to the market to buy flour. In the real sense, you cannot consume flour in its state. But when mom transforms flour to cake, you can then consume cake. So in that context, flour has form utility because it can be transformed from one state to another. And that state in which it is transformed into is what brings satisfaction, not actually the flour. Let's proceed. Place utility. Place utility can be obtained through the process of making goods and services available within a location. For example, it will be useless for a cement dealer to site his shop near a citadel of learning, a school. Do you know why? Students are not building houses there, so he won't sell. But what if we have a bookshop close to the school? Such will make impact. As such, a cement shop has no place utility around a citadel of learning. But a bookshop will surely have place utility around a citadel of learning. So I believe you can understand place utility with respect to this example. And lastly, possession utility. This refers to the satisfaction a consumer derives from using goods or services. Let me give an example. The satisfaction daddy derives from driving his friend's car is different from that he derives from driving his personal car. Do you know why? When daddy is driving his friend's car, he's considering the roads he's taking. He doesn't want to enter potholes. He doesn't want to overpress the accelerator so that probably he will not damage the car. He's not relaxed because he knows the car does not belong to him. But when daddy is driving his car, he relaxes. The car belongs to him. He can go the length he wants to. He can visit friends with the car. But he can't do such when he's using his friend's car, especially when he was not the one that bought the fuel. So you see that when you possess something, you derive more satisfaction from what you possess than from what you borrowed. That explains possession utility. Let's continue this class by analyzing utility. The concept of utility can be analyzed basically by two schools of thoughts. These schools of thoughts are the cardinal school of thought and the ordinal school of thought. Let's look at the cardinal school of thought. This school of thought emphasizes that utility is measurable. That means when you drink your glass of water, we could measure the satisfaction you derived from drinking the glass of water. Furthermore, this school of thought tells us that utility can be evaluated through the use of figures ranging from 0 to infinity. Assumptions of the cardinal approach. There are 5 assumptions of the cardinal school of thought with respect to utility. What are these assumptions? The first one is that total utility to you depends on the quantity of goods or services utilized. The second assumption is that money income of the consumer is held constant. That means K is equal to I. K represents the constant and I represents income. The third assumption is that there is diminishing marginal utility. The fourth assumption is that the consumer is rational. I will explain later. And lastly, we have it that utility is measurable. Note that these assumptions are derived from the concepts of total utility, average utility, and marginal utility. So let's look at total utility. Total utility refers to the overall satisfaction derived from the consumption of goods or services. So if I am thirsty and I buy a bottle of Coke, and after consuming the bottle of Coke I am not filled, the one bottle of Coke was not able to satisfy my thirst, and I go further to buy another bottle of Coke. After consuming this one, I am now satisfied. Total utility tells us that my satisfaction came from the consumption of 2 bottles of Coke. Now, you can have your total utility when you multiply your average utility by the quantity consumed. So in this case, my average utility was 1. The quantity I took was 2. Why do I say my average utility was 1? I took just Coke. That was just the product I took because I needed to quench my thirst. How many bottles did I consume? 2. So in that case, my total utility was what? 2. Now, this image shows us a typical total utility curve. It starts from 0 and it goes up. Now, at this point, where you have your point of saturation, that is where we call the point of maximum utility. It means that at this point, whatsoever you consumed did not bring any satisfaction to you, because after this point, the graph falls. So we have it as a point of saturation, where no matter what you consumed, no satisfaction was derived. So that is it for the concept of total utility. Now, what is average utility? Average utility refers to the satisfaction a consumer derives from the consumption of a single unit of a commodity. Now I'm going to use a similar or something you will understand better. Biscuit. When you open a pack of biscuit, it maybe contains 4 pieces. You take one, you're not satisfied, you take another. Average utility measures the satisfaction you derive from consuming each piece of biscuit. That means when you took the first one, we ought to calculate the satisfaction you derived, and then when you took the second one, we also have to calculate the satisfaction you derived. So let's say we have 6 loaves of bread. So I'm going to do a little calculation for you here. We have utils, and then we have quantity. Now, for this class, satisfaction is measured in utils. So we are looking at the satisfaction gotten from the consumption of bread. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. When one quantity of bread was taken, this young man, not myself, but this young man had 2 utils. When he consumed 2 quantity of bread, he had 4. When he consumed 3, he had 12. Look at what happens when he consumed 4. He had 6. He consumed 5, he had 6. And when he consumed 6, he had 4. Now, when you get to this point, you find out that after consuming 3, he had 12. On consuming 4, he had 6. It means it is dropping. But average utility tells us that when this man consumed 1, this is what he got. By consuming 2, his satisfaction doubled to 4. That's what average utility tells us. Let's proceed by looking at our graph. In economics, the kind of graph you get depends on the values you have with the relationship given. So this might be my graph for average utility based on the data I used, but this might not be yours. So don't take it that all average utility curves will look like this. It depends on the values given to you. But one thing you must know is that it has to slope downwards. Yes, it has to slope downwards from left to right. Let's go further to look at the third concept, which is marginal utility. Marginal utility refers to the additional satisfaction derived from the consumption of an additional unit of a product. It could be a combination of 2 products, but in this case we are concentrating on 1 product. So what we are looking at is a change in the total utility, which is T2 minus T1 over C2 minus C1. Now, this graph represents a typical marginal utility curve. When you take a closer look at this graph, you see that when 1 unit of a commodity was consumed, if we track it, it will take us to 45. But see what happens when 2 units was taken. When 2 units was taken, this graph is going upwards. It was actually coming down, but suddenly it is going up. And then gradually when another unit was taken, it started coming down. That's what marginal utility tells us. It tells us that the consumption of more and more units of a product leads to a satisfaction. And after the point of satisfaction, dissatisfaction sets in. That means you take 1 bottle of Coke, you're refreshed. Take another one, you're refreshed, but you're not satisfied. You take the 3rd bottle, you're satisfied. But because you are addicted to Coke, you take another one. The 4th bottle does not add satisfaction to you. That is what marginal utility is telling us. That 4th bottle is due to your addiction to Coke and not to satisfy thirst. Let's look at the law of diminishing marginal utility. This law states that as a consumer consumes more and more units of a commodity, utility of that commodity will increase up to a certain point when disunity, meaning dissatisfaction, will set in as a result of continuous consumption of the same commodity. Like I said in the example I used, when you took the 4th bottle, you're taking it because you don't want to quench thirst. You're taking it because you're addicted to Coke. Criticisms of the law of diminishing marginal utility. The following are the criticisms of the law of marginal utility. The first is that the assumption of this law that all goods, all commodities can be divided into small units is not always realistic. Your dad cannot divide his car into smaller units in order to derive satisfaction. That won't take him nowhere. The second limitation to this law is that there are some commodities that the more one has them, the more of the commodities one will keep wanting to have. Example, money and gold. This law tells us that it gets to the point where you have money and you don't want to have money again. I totally disagree with that, because when you have money, you keep wanting to have money. The third limitation to this law is that the habits and pulse of a consumer makes it impossible to measure the marginal utility of the commodity before consumed. This is what I was trying to tell you as I was explaining with the bottle of Coke. We cannot measure satisfaction because of habits and pulse. If somebody is addicted to something, we cannot say how much of that product will satisfy the person. So we cannot measure satisfaction with respect to that. A bottle of Coke might quench your thirst, might get you satisfied. That same bottle of Coke might not be enough for me. So we cannot measure satisfaction using those variables. And lastly, the law states that diminishing marginal utility starts operating from the origin, which is 0, whereas it started increasing before the origin. It doesn't start from the origin, it started increasing before the origin. When you look at the marginal utility curve, it started from up and not from down. Let's look at the relationship between total utility and marginal utility. This relationship holds that when total utility is increasing, marginal utility is also increasing. But marginal utility must be below total utility except when the first unit is consumed. So let's explain. We can see that at this stage, total utility is increasing, but marginal utility at the beginning is decreasing. But it gets to the point where marginal utility starts increasing. At this point, it is increasing but below total utility. So it captures our first point. The second point states that when total utility is maximized, marginal utility is usually 0. At this point, total utility is maximized. This is the maximum point of total utility. After this point, total utility starts dropping. But let's look at what happens to marginal utility. It strikes the X bar. At that point, it is 0. So when total utility is maximized, the marginal utility is at 0. So it captures the second point. The last one states that when TU, being total utility, is decreasing, marginal utility is usually negative. So after these 2 points, TU starts falling. And after this point, our marginal utility cuts the x-axis and assumes a negative sign. So that also captures our relationship between total utility and marginal utility. Now let's look at utility maximization. Now this refers to consumer equilibrium. It is the point where the maximum satisfaction of a consumer equates the price of the commodity consumed. That means when a consumer consumes a bottle of Coke and he is satisfied, we assume that the maximum satisfaction equates the price of Coca-Cola. So if price of Coca-Cola is 100 naira, it means that it took 100 naira to satisfy this young man. So the example stated that if a man is thirsty and he goes ahead to buy a soft drink, and after taking a soft drink of 100 naira, that was able to quench his thirst. Now, because he did not need an additional bottle of that soft drink to get to that point where we could say he is satisfied, it means that at that point, his satisfaction equates the price of the soft drink. And then we could gladly say that his marginal utility is 0. So when the marginal utility, for instance, of this product Coke equates the price of the Coke, at that point marginal utility is equal to 0. Okay. Now for maximum utility for a rational consumer who consumes two products, let's say commodity A and commodity B. MU can be calculated as MUX over PX, that is marginal utility of commodity X divided by the price of commodity X is equal to the marginal utility of commodity Y over the price of commodity Y. Now let's say we have bread and butter. You're taking bread and you're taking butter. So we are looking at the satisfaction derived from bread and butter. So in this case, we'll be looking at the marginal utility derived from bread over the price of bread being equal to the marginal utility of butter over the price of butter. So it gets to the point where the consumer has to determine what quantity of bread and butter will satisfy him. Am I supposed to take a little of bread and more of butter to gain my satisfaction, or more bread and a little butter to derive my satisfaction? So with this, for two commodities, for a rational consumer who is not addicted to bread and butter, because if you love bread and butter, then this formula is not for you. But for someone who wants to just satisfy hunger, then this goes. Let's look at the second school of thought, which is the ordinal approach. Now, for the ordinal approach, this school of thought tells us that the consumer makes a scale of preference. That means I am looking at the money in my pocket and I am listing the things I need, the things that will satisfy me. So I am not going to be looking for wants now, I'm looking for needs. So you have a list, the list might be many, you can scramble them over and over again until you get the perfect fit that suits your budget and satisfies you. That's what the ordinal approach talks about. This approach assumes that utility can be ranked. Okay, in the house you see mommy having various lists. Today she comes up with a list of provisions. She lists them out from Milo down to sugar, and then before Saturday she cancels the list and says no, the children are eating too much junk, they need real food. So you have another list of gari with the same budget, mind you. You have another list of gari, rice and the rest of them, and then she says, we can manage what is in the house. Let's maybe get a television set that we could watch and enjoy during the weekend. Whatever mommy decides to buy at that point in time is what she feels will bring maximum satisfaction. She has discarded provision, discarded the need to stock the house of more food stuff, and opted probably for television set. Now, by getting a television set for the same amount of money budgeted for provisions and foodstuff, it therefore means that the television set gotten gave her the maximum satisfaction required. So the ordinal approach tells us that we could rank the list. In this case now, the list of television becomes 1, the other 2 follows. Now this image tells us how the ordinal school of thought ranks consumption or utility. Now we find out that we have good Y here and we have good X. That means the ordinal school of thought is telling us that they have to be a combination of two goods. So let's say this is bread and this is butter. And then we have this blue line stating our budget line. This line crossing down states the amount of money we have to satisfy this need. Now we have 3 curves. These curves are known as indifference curves. So this is one indifference curve, this is another indifference curve, and then we have the last indifference curve. This shows us the various satisfaction level of this consumer, and a combination of these 3 gives you the indifference map. Now our emphasis is on the second indifference curve, because when this budget line was drawn, it struck the second indifference curve at the base, and that equates that at this point QY equates QX, and that was where the consumer derived maximum satisfaction with the available income. So with this income, the consumer was able to have this satisfaction, and that was able to sustain the consumer. This meant that the consumer had 3 different combinations of bread and butter, but with his budget, this was the best fit. And that is what ordinal approach is telling us, that the income determines how a consumer will combine the resources he or she has in order to meet maximum satisfaction. Having considered the 2 school of thoughts of utility theories, we have come to the end of today's class. But before I go, let's take a quick summary of what we have learnt thus far. In this class, we learnt that the ability of a commodity or service to satisfy human wants is referred to as utility. We also learnt that there are 4 types of utility, and they are time utility, form utility, place utility, and possession utility. Next, we learnt that utility can be analyzed by 2 schools of thoughts, which are the cardinal school of thought and the ordinal school of thought. Furthermore, we learnt that the ordinal school of thought assumes that utility is ranked, while the cardinal school of thought assumes that utility is measured. We also learnt that total utility refers to total amount of satisfaction a consumer derives from the consumption of a particular commodity at a point in time. Next, we learnt that average utility is the amount of satisfaction a consumer derives from the consumption of a unit of a commodity. And lastly, we learnt that utility is maximized at the point where consumer's marginal utility equates the price of the commodity consumed. Don't be in a hurry to go. Let's test ourselves on what we have learned in today's class by taking few test questions. Question 1. Dash is the amount of satisfaction a consumer derives from the consumption of a unit of a commodity. Option A, average utility. Option B, marginal utility. Or option C, total utility. The right answer to this question is option A, average utility. Question 2. The cardinal approach of utility assumes that utility can be dash. A, ranked. B, measured. C, effective. The correct answer to this question is B, measured. This is where we draw the curtain close in our class for today. I hope you can differentiate between the cardinal school of thought and the ordinal school of thought. Until I see you in another interesting economics class. Bye-bye.